The train hissed as it came to a stop, steam curling around the platform like ghostly tendrils. I tightened my coat around me, the chill in the air, cutting sharper than usual. My husband, Edward, stepped off ahead of me, his hand resting lightly on his cane as he looked back to ensure I was following. It was a familiar gesture, one I'd grown accustomed to over our 50 years of marriage. But my mind wasn't on Edward, nor the busy train station bustling with travelers. My thoughts were elsewhere, caught in a strange and sudden sense of unease. As I stepped onto the platform, the scent of soot and damp stone mixed with the murmur of voices, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt the past pressing against me like a shadow. Then I saw him. He was standing near the far edge of the platform, partially obscured by the steam still drifting from the train. He looked older, of course, he did, but there was something in his posture, the way he stood with his shoulders back and his head tilted slightly to the side, that was achingly familiar. My breath caught, and for a moment, I thought I might faint. It couldn't be. It simply couldn't be. Carol? Edward's voice cut through my daze, his tone edged with concern. Are you all right? I nodded quickly, forcing a smile as I clutched the handle of my bag tighter. I'm fine, I said, though my voice wavered. Good, he said, adjusting his scarf. Let's find a bench. My legs acting up again. I followed him, but my eyes kept drifting back to the man. He was turning now, moving through the crowd with slow, deliberate steps. My heart raced as his face came into view, lined with age but unmistakable. It was him. It was Henry. Henry had been my everything once, a lifetime ago. I was young then, barely 20, and the world was on the brink of war. We'd met in the summer of 1938, when the air was thick with the kind of anticipation that made every moment feel electric. He was charming and daring in ways I wasn't, and he had a way of looking at me that made me feel like the only person in the world. We'd had an affair, short but intense, and then he'd vanished. He was called to serve, I'd been told, and shortly after, there were rumors of his death. I hadn't allowed myself to grieve properly. I'd thrown myself into my work and eventually married Edward, who was steady and kind. But there had always been a small part of me that wondered, that hoped. Now, here he was, alive and walking toward me as if no time had passed at all. Carol? Edward said again, pulling me back to the present. You're staring. I blinked, realizing I'd stopped in the middle of the platform. I'm sorry, I murmured, shaking my head. I thought I saw someone I recognized. Edward chuckled softly. You always think you see someone. It's this old station, it plays tricks on the mind. I nodded absently, but my eyes remained fixed on Henry. He was closer now, close enough that I could see the way his dark hair had turned silver at the temples, the deep creases around his eyes. He stopped suddenly, his gaze sweeping across the crowd until it landed on me. Our eyes met, and the air seemed to shift. I felt a strange tightening in my chest, as though the years had collapsed in an instant. I wanted to say something, to call out to him, but my throat felt dry, my words caught. Henry's expression changed. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something softer, something almost mournful. He started toward me, and I felt frozen in place, torn between the past and the present. Carol, he said, his voice tentative, as though he didn't trust his own eyes. Hearing my name from his lips was like a jolt to the system. Henry, I whispered, barely able to believe it. Edward, standing beside me, frowned in confusion. Who's this? He asked. I struggled for words, my mind racing. He's an old friend, I said finally, my voice shaking. Henry stopped a few feet away, his gaze flicking between me and Edward. It's been a long time, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. It has, I managed, my hands trembling. I thought you were dead. A faint smile touched his lips. Not quite, he said. Though there were moments I thought I might be. The atmosphere around us seemed to dim, the noise of the station fading into a dull hum. My heart was pounding, and I felt a strange mix of emotions, shock, relief, guilt. Edward was looking at me now, his brow furrowed, and I knew I would have to explain later. But for now, all I could think about was the man standing in front of me, the man I had loved and lost. "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It's a long story," he said, his eyes filled with a sadness I didn't fully understand. "One I'd like to tell you, if you'll let me." Edward cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Carol, are you sure you're all right? Perhaps we should sit down." I nodded quickly, forcing myself to focus. "Yes, of course. Let's sit." Henry hesitated, then gestured toward a bench nearby. "I'll leave you to it," he said. "But if you'd like to talk." I reached out, touching his arm lightly. "Wait," I said. "Don't go." We sat together on the bench, the three of us, and for the first time in decades, the past and present collided in a way I couldn't have imagined. As Henry began to speak, recounting the years that had passed, I felt the weight of the choices I had made, the life I had built, and the questions that had remained unanswered. But even as I listened, a strange feeling crept over me, a feeling that there was more to this meeting than I understood. Something deeper, something hidden. And I was about to find out what it was. Sitting on the bench with Henry and Edward felt surreal, as though I had stepped into a story I barely recognized as my own. Henry's voice carried the weight of years, steady but tinged with something I couldn't quite name, regret, perhaps, or weariness. Edward sat beside me, his posture stiff, his hand resting on his cane. He hadn't said much since Henry joined us, but I could feel his unease. "I'm not sure where to start," Henry said, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Start wherever you need to," I said, my voice soft but urgent. I wanted to hear everything, how he had survived, why he had vanished, and how it was possible that he was sitting here now, alive and in front of me. Henry hesitated, then began to speak. "After the war started, everything happened so fast. I was sent overseas, France first, then Germany. It was chaos, Carol. We were just trying to stay alive." I nodded, my heart aching at the thought of what he must have endured. "I heard you were killed in action," I said quietly. "That's what they told everyone," he said, his gaze distant. "There was an ambush. My unit was hit hard, and I was separated from the others. I was injured, badly. The medics assumed I wouldn't make it, so they left me behind." I gasped softly, my hand covering my mouth. "Henry." "I woke up in a field hospital days later," he continued. "A local farmer had found me and brought me there. By then, the war had moved on, and I was presumed dead." Edward shifted beside me, his expression unreadable. "And you didn't think to contact anyone? To let Carol know you were alive?" Henry's jaw tightened. "It wasn't that simple. I had no identification, no way to prove who I was. I was sent to a recovery camp, and by the time I was well enough to travel, I didn't know where to start." I could feel Edward's tension radiating beside me, but I couldn't take my eyes off Henry. "You could have tried," I said, my voice trembling. "I did," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But by the time I found my way back, you were gone. The house was empty, and no one could tell me where you were. I thought it was too late." The noise of the train station seemed to fade into the background as his words settled over me. I thought of the years I had spent wondering, the unanswered questions that had haunted me. And yet, hearing his story, I couldn't bring myself to blame him. The war had taken so much from all of us, time, certainty, and the people we loved. "Why now?" I asked. "Why are you here, after all this time?" Henry hesitated, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I wasn't looking for you, Carol," he said. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again. But when I stepped off the train and saw you, I couldn't believe it. I had to know if it was really you." The air between us felt heavy, charged with everything we weren't saying. Edward cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Carol," he said, his tone measured, "this is unexpected, to say the least." I turned to him, guilt tightening in my chest. "I know," I said softly. I don't even know what to think." Edward's expression softened slightly, but there was still a flicker of unease in his eyes. "You've always carried a part of your past with you," he said. "I suppose I never expected it to walk up and sit beside us." His words stung, though I knew they weren't meant to. Edward had been my rock, my partner in a life we had built together. But he didn't know the depth of what Henry and I had shared, the way it had shaped me even after I thought I had moved on. Henry shifted in his seat, his eyes searching mine. "Carol, I don't want to disrupt your life. I can see you're happy, and that's all I ever wanted for you." "I'm not sure what I am right now," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But I can't ignore this, seeing you again, hearing your story. It feels like fate." Edward stiffened slightly, and I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm not saying I want to change anything," I said, glancing between the two of them. "But there's so much I need to understand." Henry nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I feel the same way," he said. "There's more to tell, Carol. More that I think you need to hear." "What do you mean?" I asked, a knot forming in my stomach. He hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the bustling platform. "The war took everything from me," he said finally. "But before it did, I found something I never expected. Something that changed everything." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt a strange sense of foreboding. There was more to this story, more than I had imagined, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what it would reveal. The train station seemed to close in around us, the noise and movement fading into the background as Henry's words hung in the air. I felt the past pressing against me, its weight heavier than ever. And as I looked into his eyes, I realized that the truth, the full truth, was still waiting to be uncovered. Henry's words hung in the air between us, heavy with a meaning I couldn't yet grasp. My heart raced as I studied his face, searching for clues, for something that might anchor me in this strange, surreal moment. Edward sat beside me, his expression carefully neutral, though I could sense the tension radiating from him. Whatever Henry was about to reveal, I knew it would change everything. "What do you mean, Henry?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What did you find?" Henry hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. He clasped them tightly, the way a man does when he's carrying a weight he doesn't know how to put down. "It's not easy to explain," he said finally. "But it's something I've carried with me since before the war. Something I've been trying to understand myself." I felt Edward shift beside me, his grip on his cane tightening. "This sounds cryptic," he said, his tone edged with suspicion. "If you have something to say, mister," he paused, realizing he hadn't been introduced. "Henry," I said quickly, glancing at Edward. "This is Henry." "Henry," Edward repeated, his brow furrowing. "Well, if you have something to say, I think you should come out with it." Henry's gaze flicked between us, and I could see the hesitation in his eyes. "It's complicated," he said, his voice low. "And it goes back a long way. Longer than either of you might think." I frowned, confusion swirling in my mind. "What do you mean?" Henry leaned back slightly, running a hand through his silvered hair. "Before the war, before I met you, Carol, there were things I didn't know about myself. About where I came from. My mother died when I was young, and my father, he was distant. I never felt like I had a real family. But just before I left for France, I found something that changed everything." "What did you find?" I pressed, my heart pounding. He looked at me, his expression pained. "A letter," he said. "It was tucked away in an old box in my father's attic. It was from a woman who claimed to have given birth to me. She wrote that she had to give me up, that she'd had no choice." My breath caught, and I felt the world tilt slightly. "What are you saying, Henry?" "I'm saying I wasn't who I thought I was," he said. "That I was taken from my birth mother as a baby, and she spent the rest of her life trying to find me." A chill ran down my spine. Edward leaned forward, his face pale but composed. "And you believe this letter?" "I didn't at first," Henry admitted. "It seemed impossible. But as I read it, as I pieced together the little I knew about my childhood, it started to make sense. And then, after the war, I found records, old hospital logs, adoption papers. They confirmed it. I stared at him, my mind racing. "Henry," I said, my voice trembling. "Why are you telling me this now? What does it have to do with us?" His eyes softened, and I saw something in them that made my heart ache, a mixture of sorrow and hope. "Because, Carol," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The woman who wrote that letter, she mentioned another child. A sibling. Someone she lost along with me." The words hit me like a thunderclap, and I felt a strange tightening in my chest. "A sibling?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "You mean?" Henry nodded. "I didn't know until recently," he said. "But as I've searched over the years, I've found pieces of the puzzle. Records, photos, fragments of a life I never knew. And the more I uncovered, the more I realized that sibling might be you." The train station seemed to spin around me, the noise and movement blurring into a surreal haze. I stared at Henry, my mind struggling to process what he was saying. "No," I said, shaking my head. "That's not possible." "It is," Henry said gently. "I've spent years trying to find you, Carol. I didn't expect to see you here, like this. But the moment I saw your face, I knew." Edward's hand tightened on mine, his presence grounding me in the storm of emotions. "Carol," he said softly, "this is a lot. Are you all right?" I nodded, though tears were streaming down my face. "I don't know," I admitted. "This doesn't make sense." Henry reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, weathered photo. He handed it to me, and I felt my breath catch as I saw the image. It was a faded photograph of a woman holding two infants, her face weary but kind. She looked familiar in a way I couldn't explain, and I felt a strange, almost primal connection to her. "This is our mother," Henry said, his voice trembling. "And those are us." I couldn't speak. The photo shook in my hands as I stared at it, trying to reconcile the life I had known with the revelation Henry had just laid before me. If he was telling the truth, then everything I thought I knew about my past, about my family, was a lie. "I don't understand," I said finally, my voice breaking. "Why didn't anyone tell me? Why didn't I know?" "I don't have all the answers," Henry said. "But I've been searching for you, Carol. And now that I've found you, I need you to know the truth." The weight of his words settled over me, and I felt a strange mixture of emotions, shock, anger, sadness, and a flicker of something else. Hope. The kind of hope I hadn't felt in years. Edward cleared his throat, his voice steady. "Carol," he said, "we'll figure this out. Together." As I sat there, the photo still clutched in my hands, I realized that my life, the life I thought I knew, had changed in an instant. Henry wasn't just a ghost from my past. He was something far more profound. My brother. And as the noise of the station returned, I knew that this was only the beginning of a story I never expected to live. The weight of Henry's revelation settled over me like a heavy fog, making it hard to think, to breathe. My brother? The words didn't feel real, but the photograph in my trembling hand spoke otherwise. The woman holding the two infants, one of whom was me, stared back at me with eyes I now realized were so achingly familiar. My mind raced through memories that felt like they were slipping through my fingers, leaving only questions in their wake. Edward sat beside me, his hand resting lightly on mine, his face etched with quiet concern. "Carol," he said softly, breaking the silence. "Are you all right?" I looked at him, my throat tight, and managed a shaky nod. I don't know," I admitted. "I thought I knew my life, Edward. I thought I knew who I was." Henry shifted in his seat, his expression a mix of hope and unease. "I understand this is a lot," he said. "I've been living with the truth for years, but for you, it's all so sudden." "Sudden?" I said, my voice trembling. "Henry, this is my entire life. My past. My identity. And you're telling me it's something I never even knew? The train station, bustling moments ago, now felt like a muted backdrop to a moment I couldn't have prepared for. The hum of conversations and the clatter of luggage seemed far away, irrelevant compared to the storm of emotion swirling inside me. I turned the photograph over, hoping for a note, a name, anything that might provide answers, but the back was blank. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice soft but urgent. "Our mother." "What do you know about her?" Henry's expression softened, a shadow of sadness passing over his face. "Her name was Eleanor," he said. "She was young when she had us, barely 20. She never married. From what I pieced together, she was forced to give us up because she didn't have the means to care for us." "Both of us?" I asked, my heart tightening. Henry nodded. "Yes. But we didn't end up in the same place. I was sent to one family, and you were sent to another. She tried to find us later, but by then, it was too late. The records were sealed, and the war made everything harder." I stared at him, my mind struggling to reconcile the life I thought I knew with this new reality. My parents, the ones who raised me, who I'd loved and mourned, had never told me I was adopted. Had they known? Had they kept this secret from me intentionally, or had they been as unaware as I was? Why didn't I know? I whispered, my voice trembling. Why didn't anyone tell me? Henry reached out, his hand hovering just above mine before he let it fall back into his lap. "I don't know, Carol. I've spent years asking myself the same question. But when I found the letter, when I started putting the pieces together, I realized I had to find you. I just didn't expect to see you here, like this." Edward shifted beside me, his voice steady but gentle. "Henry," he said, "this is quite the revelation. But how can you be sure? A letter and a photograph, they aren't proof." Henry met Edward's gaze, his expression firm. "I understand your doubt," he said. "But I followed every lead, every record. The dates, the places, they all line up. And the moment I saw Carol, I knew. I've seen that face every day in the mirror." The certainty in his voice sent a chill down my spine. I studied his face again, really studied it, and for the first time I saw the resemblance. The same cheekbones, the same slope of the nose. And the eyes that mirrored my own in ways I'd never noticed before. The question swirled in my mind, relentless and unyielding. Why had no one told me? Why had it taken decades for the truth to come to light? And why now, of all times, was I learning about a family I never knew I had? "We need to know for sure," I said finally, my voice steadier now. "If what you're saying is true, we need proof." Henry nodded, his expression calm but resolute. "I understand. There are records, Carol. Documents that confirm everything I've told you. I can show them to you." "Then let's see them," I said, my heart pounding. "Because I don't know what to believe right now." We left the station together, the three of us walking side by side but worlds apart in our thoughts. Edward stayed close, his hand brushing against mine in quiet reassurance. I could feel his concern, his unease, but I was grateful for his steady presence. As we stepped outside into the crisp air, I glanced at Henry, who was watching me with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "I want to understand," I said, my voice soft but firm. "But this is a lot, Henry. I need time." "You'll have it," he said, his voice steady. "Take all the time you need, Carol. I'm not going anywhere." Later that evening, as I sat at home with Edward, the photograph resting on the table between us, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. My husband poured me a cup of tea, his movements slow and deliberate, and sat beside me. "This is unexpected," he said, his voice gentle. "But Carol, no matter what the truth is, it doesn't change who you are. It doesn't change the life we've built together." I nodded, tears welling in my eyes. "I know," I said. "But it changes how I see everything. It changes the past." "Then let's face it together," he said, his hand covering mine. As I stared at the photograph, the faces of the woman and the two infants blurred by my tears, I knew I had to find the truth. Whether it brought closure, pain, or something in between, I couldn't let this moment pass without understanding what it meant. I had found a brother. But what else would I uncover along the way? The next morning, I woke with the photograph still clutched in my hand, its edges soft and worn from my restless grip. Sleep had been fitful, my dreams filled with flashes of faces and moments I couldn't quite place. The weight of Henry's revelation pressed on me like a physical force, and though the sun streamed through the curtains, its warmth did little to ease my unease. Edward sat at the kitchen table when I joined him, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. He looked up as I entered, offering me a soft smile. "You barely slept," he said. "How could I?" I replied, taking the seat across from him. "Everything I thought I knew, it's all been turned upside down." Edward reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. "We'll figure it out, Carol," he said. "Whatever the truth is, we'll face it together." Later that morning, I met Henry at a quiet cafe near the train station. He was already seated when I arrived, a small pile of papers and photographs spread out on the table before him. His expression was a mix of determination and trepidation, and I could see the weight of the years etched into his face. "Thank you for meeting me," he said as I sat down. "I didn't think I had much of a choice," I replied, though my tone wasn't unkind. "You've left me with too many questions to ignore." Henry nodded, sliding one of the papers toward me. "This is where I started," he said. "The letter I told you about. It was written by our mother." I picked up the paper, my hands trembling slightly as I read the faded words. The letter was brief but heartfelt, written in careful handwriting that spoke of both desperation and love. "To my dearest child. I never wanted to let you go. Please know this was not my choice, but one forced upon me by circumstances beyond my control. You are loved, and I pray that one day, you will find your way back to the truth. You have a sibling, a brother, who was taken as well. My heart is with you both always. Eleanor." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I set the letter down carefully, as though it might shatter under my touch. This doesn't prove anything," I said, though my voice faltered. "I know," Henry said, his tone gentle. "But it's where it began." From there, I started digging. Birth records, adoption papers, anything I could find. And eventually, I found this. He slid another paper toward me, a hospital record dated the year I was born. My name wasn't on it, but there were two entries, Baby A and Baby B twins, both marked as being given up for adoption. "This is us," Henry said. "It matches the timeline, the location, everything." I stared at the document, my mind spinning. "And you think one of those babies is me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know it is," he said. "I've followed every lead, Carol. Every road has led back to you." I felt my chest tighten, the enormity of his words pressing down on me. "Why didn't I know?" I asked, more to myself than to him. "Why didn't my parents tell me?" Henry's expression softened. "Maybe they didn't know," he said. "Or maybe they thought it was better this way. Adoption was handled differently back then. Secrets were kept, even when they shouldn't have been." We spent the next hour going through the documents and photographs, each piece fitting into a puzzle I hadn't even known existed. Hospital records, census data, letters, each one built upon the last, painting a picture of a shared past I was only beginning to understand. But there were still gaps, still questions that lingered in the spaces between the facts. Where had our mother gone after giving us up? Had she ever tried to find us again? And why had it taken so long for this truth to come to light? As we finished, Henry leaned back in his chair, his expression weary but hopeful. "I know this is overwhelming," he said. "But I needed you to know. I couldn't keep searching without you." I nodded slowly, my mind still racing. "I don't know what to do with all of this," I admitted. "It's like my life has been rewritten in a single day." "Take your time," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." When I returned home, Edward was waiting for me, his gaze filled with quiet concern. "How did it go?" he asked. "It's a lot," I said, sitting beside him. "But I think he's telling the truth." Edward nodded, his hand resting on mine. "And what does that mean for you?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I can't ignore it. If this is who I am, if Henry really is my brother, I need to know." That evening, I sat by the fire, the documents spread out before me. The weight of the truth pressed heavily on my shoulders, but beneath it, I felt a flicker of something else. Hope. The idea that I had found a piece of myself I hadn't even known was missing. As I stared at the photograph of Eleanor holding the two infants, a question rose in my mind, one I hadn't dared to voice before. Could finding Henry also mean finding her? The thought filled me with both fear and longing, and I knew that my journey was far from over. The photograph of Eleanor holding the two infants remained fixed in my mind. It was a tangible connection to a woman I had no memory of, but who had given me life. As I sat by the fire that evening, the weight of her absence pressed heavily on me, and I realized that understanding her, finding her, if possible, had become as important as uncovering the truth about Henry. Edward sat across from me, his brow furrowed as he studied the documents Henry had shared. "There's a lot here," he said, his voice steady but thoughtful. "But it doesn't tell us what happened to her." "That's what I need to know," I replied. "Why did she give us up? And what became of her after?" Edward leaned forward, resting his hand on mine. "Then we'll find out," he said. "Whatever it takes." The next morning, I met Henry at the cafe again. He looked tired, as though the weight of the past had kept him awake as well. But when he saw me, his expression softened, and I could see a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "I've been thinking about Eleanor," I said as I sat down. "About what happened to her after we were born. Do you know anything?" Henry shook his head. "Not much," he admitted. "I found fragments, her name in census records, a mention in a city directory. But after the war started, she disappears." "Disappears?" I asked, my stomach tightening. He nodded. "It's like she vanished. But I think the answer might be in those adoption records. They're sealed, but there has to be a way to access them." We spent the next few hours discussing our options. Henry had already tried contacting the agencies involved, but the process was slow and bureaucratic. It seemed that the secrets of the past were buried behind layers of red tape, and the more we pushed, the more resistance we encountered. "It's like they don't want us to know," Henry said, frustration edging his voice. "We have to find a way," I said firmly. "If Eleanor wanted us to find her, she would have left something, anything, for us to follow." Our breakthrough came when Edward suggested we look into local archives. "If she was recorded in the census and city directories," he said, "there might be other mentions of her. Old newspapers, letters, property records, they could all hold clues." It was a long shot, but it was something. Henry and I spent the next week combing through dusty archives, poring over faded pages and microfilm reels. It was tedious work, but each discovery, no matter how small, felt like a step closer to understanding the woman who had brought us into the world. One afternoon, as I flipped through a stack of old newspapers, I found something that made my breath catch. It was a classified ad, dated 1941, placed by a woman named Eleanor Parker. "Seeking information on the whereabouts of my children, born 1922. Please contact with any news. I will never stop searching." The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I handed the paper to Henry, my hand trembling. "She was looking for us," I whispered. Henry read the ad silently, his jaw tightening. "She never gave up," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Even after all those years." The ad gave us a new lead. Eleanor had used her maiden name, Parker, and the contact information listed an address in the city. It was a thread we could pull, and I felt a renewed sense of hope as we set out to uncover more. We tracked down the address, though the building was long gone, replaced by a modern office complex. But the archives revealed that Eleanor had lived there for several years, working as a seamstress and volunteering at a local shelter. Her life, though simple, seemed marked by quiet determination. She was strong, Henry said as we pieced together her story. She had to be. As we dug deeper, another discovery added to the mystery. A hospital record from 1942 showed that Eleanor had been admitted for several weeks, suffering from an illness that wasn't specified. The record listed no family members or visitors, and when she was discharged, there was no further mention of her. It's like she vanished again, I said, frustration bubbling in my chest. Henry placed a hand on my shoulder. We're closer than we've ever been, Carol, he said. We'll find her. The search consumed us for weeks, each discovery leading to more questions. Edward supported me at every step, his quiet strength a constant comfort. But as we uncovered more about Eleanor's life, I began to feel the weight of the years that had separated us. She had lived and struggled without me, without us, and the thought of what she must have endured filled me with a deep sadness. Then, one evening, Henry called with a new lead. I found something, he said, his voice urgent. A record from a small town upstate, a death certificate for an Eleanor Parker, dated 1945. My heart sank. She's gone? I whispered. I think so, he said. But there's more. The certificate lists a cause of death, complications from pneumonia. And there's an address, someone she was living with. Who? I asked, my breath catching. A man named George Wilson, Henry said. It could be a relative, or someone who took her in. Either way, it's the next piece of the puzzle. As I hung up the phone, a mixture of grief and determination filled me. Eleanor might be gone, but her story wasn't over. If George Wilson had known her, he might hold the answers we were searching for. And as I stared at the photograph of her holding the two infants, I felt a deep resolve settle over me. I would find out the truth, about her, about us, and about the life she had fought so hard to hold on to. The name George Wilson felt like a key to a door I wasn't sure I wanted to open. If he had known Eleanor, he might hold the answers Henry and I had spent weeks searching for. But he might also confirm what I feared most, that Eleanor had lived her final years alone, her search for us ending in heartbreak. Henry and I set out early the next morning, the address tied to George Wilson's name scribbled on a piece of paper in my trembling hand. It was in a small, quiet town nestled among rolling hills, the kind of place where time seemed to move slower. The drive was silent, the weight of our shared anticipation filling the space between us. When we arrived, the house was smaller than I expected, a modest brick bungalow with an overgrown garden. A woman in her 60s answered the door, her expression cautious, but kind. May I help you? She asked, her voice soft. Henry cleared his throat, stepping forward. We're looking for information about a man named George Wilson, he said. We believe he might have known someone important to us. The woman's brow furrowed, and for a moment, I thought she might turn us away. But then she nodded. George was my father, she said. But he passed away years ago. Why do you want to know about him? We explained everything, the discovery of the adoption records, the search for Eleanor, the pieces of the puzzle that had led us to her father's name. The woman, whose name was Margaret, listened with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy, her hand resting lightly on the doorframe. I don't know much about Eleanor, she admitted. I was just a child when she lived with us. But I do remember her. What was she like? I asked, my voice trembling. Margaret smiled faintly. She was kind. Quiet. I remember my father saying she had been through a lot. She came to stay with us after she got out of the hospital. My father worked there as a janitor, he found her with nowhere to go and brought her home. Tears pricked my eyes as I imagined Eleanor, vulnerable and alone, finding solace in a stranger's kindness. Did she ever talk about us? I asked. About her children? Margaret hesitated, her gaze softening. She did, she said finally. She carried a photograph with her, a picture of two babies. She said they were hers. I gasped softly, my hand flying to my mouth. She kept the photo? Margaret nodded. She talked about you often. She said she'd lost you both, but she never gave up hope of finding you again. The weight of Margaret's words settled over me, a mixture of grief and gratitude. Eleanor had loved us, even after all those years, even after losing everything. The thought was both comforting and heartbreaking. Do you know what happened to her? Henry asked, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret sighed. She stayed with us for a year or so, she said. But her health never fully recovered. My father did what he could, but when she got sick again, there wasn't much anyone could do. She passed away in her sleep. My father said it was peaceful. We sat in Margaret's living room for hours, piecing together the fragments of Eleanor's life. She showed us a few mementos her father had kept, a handkerchief with Eleanor's initials embroidered on it, a locket with a faded photograph of her inside. But the most meaningful piece was the photograph Margaret remembered Eleanor carrying. It's still here, she said, pulling it from a small box in the corner of the room. I kept it after my father passed. I thought it was important, even though I didn't know the whole story. She handed it to me, and my breath caught as I saw the image of Eleanor holding the two infants. It was the same photograph Henry had shown me, but this one was clearer, less worn. On the back, written in delicate handwriting, were the words, "For my darlings. I will always love you. Eleanor." I clutched the photograph to my chest, tears streaming down my face. For so long, I had felt untethered, as though my life had been built on something fragile and incomplete. But holding that photo, I felt a connection to Eleanor that was stronger than anything I had imagined. She never stopped loving us, I whispered. Henry placed a hand on my shoulder, his own eyes glistening with tears. And we found her, Carol, he said. Even if it's too late to tell her, we found her. Before we left, Margaret gave us the photograph and the locket, insisting that they belonged with us. She would have wanted you to have them, she said. She talked about you as though you were still with her, even after all those years. As we drove back, the weight of the journey settled over me. Eleanor's life had been filled with pain, but also resilience and love. She had searched for us, held on to the hope that we might find each other again, and now, in a way, we had. That night, as I sat with Edward by the fire, I held the photograph in one hand and the locket in the other. The ache of losing Eleanor was still fresh, but it was tempered by the knowledge that she had never given up on us. I looked at Edward, who had been my anchor through it all, and then at Henry, who had become a part of my life in ways I hadn't expected. We're not finished, I said softly. Eleanor's story doesn't end here. She gave us life, and we owe it to her to carry that forward. Edward nodded, his hand covering mine. And we will, he said. Together. As I gazed at the photograph, I felt a deep sense of peace. I had found Henry. I had found Eleanor. And though the road had been long and filled with loss, I knew that her love had never left us. It had carried us to this moment, binding us together across time and distance. And now, finally, I understood what it meant to be whole. The days following our visit to Margaret's home were a whirlwind of emotions. The photograph and locket felt like pieces of Eleanor herself, tangible reminders of a woman who had loved deeply, despite life's cruelties. I kept them close, often running my fingers over the smooth surface of the locket as I sat by the fire, lost in thought. Henry and I had spoken at length about what we had uncovered, and though there was a sense of closure, there was also a lingering question, what now? Our lives had been separate for so long, and though we had found each other, the paths we had walked before this discovery felt worlds apart. Edward, always the steady presence in my life, encouraged me to take time to process it all. You've spent so much energy looking back, Carol, he said one evening, his voice gentle. Maybe it's time to look forward. Henry arrived at my home a few days later, the photograph tucked carefully into a leather-bound notebook he had been using to document our journey. He looked different somehow, lighter, as though the weight of years had lifted slightly. I've been thinking, he said as we sat in the living room, a fresh pot of tea between us. Eleanor's story, it doesn't end with us. It's part of something bigger. I frowned, unsure of what he meant. What do you mean, Henry? I mean, we're not the only ones who carry her memory, he said. Margaret, her father, they were part of her life too. And there might be others. People she touched, even in small ways. We should honor that. His words struck a chord. Eleanor had been more than just our mother, she had been a person with a life and relationships beyond the tragedy of our separation. To truly understand her, we needed to piece together the fragments of her story from those who had known her. I want to write it down, Henry said after a moment. Everything we've found, everything we've learned. Not just for us, but for anyone who might come after us. For Eleanor. I nodded, the idea resonating deeply. That's a beautiful idea, I said. She deserves to be remembered. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet collaboration. Henry and I worked together, compiling documents, letters, and photographs into a coherent narrative. We reached out to Margaret again, who shared more stories of Eleanor's time with her family. Each detail, no matter how small, painted a richer picture of the woman who had given us life. Through this process, Henry and I grew closer. The awkwardness that had lingered in the wake of his initial revelation began to fade, replaced by a bond that felt both natural and profound. We weren't just siblings by chance, we were siblings by choice, determined to rebuild the connection that had been stolen from us. Edward, ever the supportive partner, became an integral part of this journey. He listened patiently as I recounted memories of my childhood, helping me reconcile the life I thought I knew with the truths I was uncovering. His steady presence reminded me that while the past was important, it was the present, and the future, that truly mattered. You and Henry have something rare, Edward said one evening as we sat together. A second chance. Don't let it slip away. Henry and I took Edward's advice to heart. We began to spend more time together, not just poring over documents, but sharing stories of our lives. He told me about his years in France, the struggles he faced as he tried to piece together his identity, and the moments of joy he had found along the way. I, in turn, shared my own journey, the love I had found with Edward, the challenges we had overcome, and the quiet happiness of the life we had built. Through these conversations, I realized how much we had missed. But I also realized how much we still had to gain. Our lives were no longer defined by the separation we had endured, but by the connection we were forging now. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch overlooking the garden, Henry turned to me, his expression thoughtful. Do you think she knew? He asked. Eleanor. Do you think she believed we'd find each other? I thought about the photograph, the words scrawled on the back, for my darlings. I will always love you. Yes, I said softly. I think she did. She never gave up on us, Henry. And we didn't give up on her. In the months that followed, Henry and I completed the book, a tribute to Eleanor and the journey that had brought us back together. We called it For My Darlings, after the inscription on the photograph. It was part memoir, part history, and wholly a labor of love. When it was finished, we held a small gathering at my home, inviting Edward, Margaret, and a few close friends. Henry read a passage from the book, his voice steady but filled with emotion, and as he spoke, I felt a profound sense of peace. Eleanor's story had been told, and though she was gone, her memory lived on in us. As the evening wound down, I found myself alone on the porch, gazing at the stars. Henry joined me after a moment, a quiet smile on his face. She'd be proud of you, he said. Of us, I corrected, reaching for his hand. She'd be proud of us. In the stillness of that moment, I felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by the warmth of something new. Henry and I had found each other, and in doing so, we had found ourselves. The journey had been long and filled with pain, but it had brought us here, to a place of understanding, connection, and love. And though Eleanor was no longer with us, I knew she was smiling down, her love still binding us together. The day we sent the manuscript to the publisher felt surreal. For months, Henry and I had poured ourselves into For My Darlings, determined to honor Eleanor's life and the journey that had reunited us. Now, as I sealed the envelope and handed it to the clerk at the post office, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, pride, and a lingering nervousness. What if no one cares? I asked Henry as we walked back to the car. He gave me a reassuring smile. They will, he said. This isn't just our story, Carol. It's hers. And there's something universal in that, about love, loss, and resilience. People will see that. The publisher's response was quicker than we expected. A few weeks later, we received a call confirming their interest. The editor, a woman named Grace, spoke passionately about the manuscript, describing it as a poignant and beautifully told exploration of family and identity. We'd be honored to publish this, she said. It's a story that deserves to be heard. Henry and I sat in stunned silence after the call, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't just a project anymore, it was becoming something bigger than ourselves. As the book moved through the publishing process, Henry and I began preparing for its release. We were nervous about stepping into the public eye, but Grace assured us that sharing our story would resonate with readers in ways we couldn't imagine. "You've both lived through something extraordinary," she said during one of our meetings. "And your willingness to be vulnerable will inspire others." I wasn't sure about inspiring anyone, but I knew one thing: sharing Eleanor's legacy was the least we could do for her. She had lived a life of quiet courage, and though she never got to see the fruits of her hope, her love had carried us here. The book launched on a rainy October evening, the chill in the air a stark contrast to the warmth of the gathering inside the small bookstore where we held the event. Friends, family, and even a few curious strangers filled the space, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of overhead lights. Henry stood beside me, the first copy of For My Darlings resting in his hands. His fingers brushed the embossed cover, his expression a mixture of pride and reflection. "You ready?" he asked, turning to me. I nodded, though my heart was racing. "As ready as I'll ever be." Henry read the opening passage, his voice steady but thick with emotion. As he spoke, I scanned the faces in the crowd, seeing tears in some eyes and quiet smiles on others. When he finished, the room erupted into applause, and I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. During the Q&A session, someone asked the question I had been dreading: "What do you wish Eleanor could know, if she were here today?" I hesitated, my throat tightening, but then I spoke from the heart. "I wish she could know that her love endured," I said. "Even through separation, even through time, it carried us. And it brought us back together." The room was silent for a moment, and then another wave of applause filled the air. As the event wound down, a woman approached us, her expression hesitant but kind. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "Your story reminded me of my own mother, who passed away last year. She had a difficult life, but she always believed in the power of love. Hearing about Eleanor, it brought her back to me in a way I can't explain." Her words stayed with me long after the event ended. For so long, I had thought of Eleanor as someone I had lost. But now, I realized that her love had never left me. It had shaped me, even in ways I hadn't understood, and now it was shaping others too. The weeks following the book's release were a whirlwind. For My Darlings resonated with readers in ways Henry and I hadn't anticipated, sparking conversations about family, resilience, and the power of connection. We received letters from people who had been moved by the story, some sharing their own experiences of loss and reunion. One letter in particular stood out. It came from a woman named Clara, who had worked at the shelter where Eleanor had volunteered. "She was one of the kindest souls I've ever known," Clara wrote. "She talked often about her children, and though she didn't have much, she gave everything she could to help others. I'm so glad her story is being told." Clara's letter led to another layer of discovery. She shared photographs of Eleanor at the shelter, smiling warmly as she served meals and comforted those in need. Seeing those images brought a new dimension to her story, reminding me that her life had been one of quiet impact. She had touched so many lives, and now, through the book, her legacy was reaching even further. One evening, as Henry and I reflected on the journey, he said something that stayed with me. "We thought we were telling Eleanor's story," he said. But in a way, she's been telling ours. She's the reason we're here, together. I nodded, tears welling in my eyes. She gave us everything, I said. And now, we get to carry her forward. As the months passed, the book became more than a tribute, it became a bridge, connecting us to others and to each other. Henry and I grew closer with each passing day, our shared history deepening the bond we had fought so hard to reclaim. Edward, ever the steady presence, remained my anchor, his quiet support a constant reminder of the love I had built in my own life. Eleanor's story had started with loss, but it had become one of resilience, connection, and love. And as I held the locket in my hand one evening, I realized that her legacy wasn't just something we carried, it was something we lived. Months after the release of For My Darlings, life had taken on a new rhythm. Henry and I had found a sense of peace in the journey we had shared, though the weight of Eleanor's absence still lingered. The book's success had opened doors we never anticipated, connections to people who had known her, stories from those whose lives mirrored our own, and a deeper understanding of the woman who had given us life. But there was one thing left to do. Henry and I agreed we needed to visit the place where Eleanor was laid to rest. It was the final piece of our journey, a way to honor her memory and to close a chapter that had shaped us in ways we were only beginning to understand. The small cemetery was nestled in the countryside, surrounded by rolling hills and dotted with ancient oak trees. The air was crisp that morning, the kind of cold that hinted at the coming winter. Edward drove us there, his presence as steady and comforting as ever. When we arrived, Henry and I stepped out of the car together, the silence between us heavy with unspoken emotion. We found her grave near the edge of the cemetery, marked by a simple stone that read, Eleanor Parker, 1902 to 1945. Beloved Mother. The words were stark yet profound. I traced them with my fingers, tears streaming down my face. She was more than this, I whispered. She was so much more. Henry knelt beside me, his hand resting on my shoulder. She lived for love, he said softly. Even when it was taken from her, she held on to it. That's what this means, Carol. That's what she gave us. We stood there for a long time, lost in our thoughts. I thought about the journey that had brought us here, the years of separation, the discoveries that had reshaped our understanding of ourselves and each other, and the love that had carried us through it all. Eleanor's story wasn't just one of loss, it was one of resilience, hope, and the unbreakable bond of family. Edward joined us after a while, a bouquet of wildflowers in his hands. He placed them gently at the base of the stone, his quiet gesture saying more than words ever could. I looked at him, my heart swelling with gratitude for his unwavering support. She'd be proud of you, he said, his voice steady. Both of you. For finding each other. For honoring her. Henry nodded, his eyes glistening. We owe her everything, he said. And now, we get to carry her forward. We stood together, the three of us, as the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the cemetery. It felt like a blessing, a reminder that Eleanor's love had transcended time and space, reaching us even now. I closed my eyes, letting the moment wash over me, and whispered a silent promise, I will carry your love with me, always. In the days that followed, Henry and I found new ways to honor Eleanor's memory. We donated copies of For My Darlings to libraries and shelters, places where her story could inspire others. We established a small fund in her name to support organizations that helped families reconnect, ensuring that her legacy would continue to make a difference. Edward, ever the practical optimist, suggested we plant a tree in our garden, a living tribute to Eleanor's strength and resilience. Henry and I agreed, and on a bright spring morning, we gathered with a few close friends and planted a young oak tree. As we pressed the soil around its base, I felt a sense of renewal, a connection to the earth and to the woman who had given us everything. Henry and I also took time to explore our own relationship, building a bond that felt both new and deeply rooted. We shared holidays, family gatherings, and quiet afternoons, filling the spaces in each other's lives that had once felt empty. The years of separation no longer defined us, instead, we were defined by the love we chose to nurture now. One evening, as I sat by the fire with Edward, I reflected on everything that had happened since that fateful day at the train station. It's strange, I said, staring into the flames. I thought my life was set, that everything I knew was solid. And then Henry appeared, and everything changed. Edward smiled, his hand covering mine. Change isn't always a bad thing, he said. Sometimes, it's what we need to grow. I nodded, my heart full. Eleanor gave us that, I said. Her love, her hope, it brought us here. As the fire crackled and the room filled with its warm glow, I felt a profound sense of peace. Eleanor's story had shaped me, but it didn't define me. What defined me now was the life I had built, the love I had found, and the connections I had reclaimed. And as I closed my eyes that night, I whispered a silent prayer of gratitude, for Eleanor, for Henry, for Edward, and for the journey that had brought us together. Because in the end, it wasn't just a story about loss. It was a story about love, resilience, and the enduring power of family. If you've enjoyed my story, please leave your comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, where your support means the world to me. I look forward to bringing you more stories that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.